Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Mark Valeri, and as the director of the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics, I welcome you to this evening's conversation about what religion offers democracy, challenges and opportunities of Christianity and Islam in contemporary America. I think we can all feel like it's time to have this conversation. It's time to be engaged and thoughtful and reflective, and we're very grateful that you're here and we have the opportunity to share this with you. The conversation will be moderated by my colleague John Inazu, who is the Sally D. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion at the Danforth Center of Religion and Politics and the Law School here at Washington University. His latest book is titled Learning to Disagree, seems also appropriate, The Surprising Path to Navigating Differences with Empathy and Respect. And his two conversation partners will be first Shadi Hamid, who is a columnist and member of the editorial board at the Washington Post, where he focuses on culture, religion, and foreign policy. He is also an assistant research professor of Islamic studies at Fuller Theological Seminary. He is the author of several books, including most recently, The Problem of Democracy. Matthew Kaemingk is the Richard John Mao Associate Professor of Faith and Public Life at Fuller Seminary and director of the Richard John Mao Institute of Faith and Public Life. He is the author of Christian Hospitality in Muslim Immigration in an Age of Fear. We're so glad you're here. We look forward to this, and let's welcome to the stage Shadi Hamid, Matthew Kaemingk, and John Inazu.
Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. Excited to have this conversation. We have actually just finished up a day and a half of a workshop around a new book that Matt and Shadi are working on. And so we're going to draw some questions from that discussion, and then after a while, we'll turn it over to you all for your questions as well. But I think maybe just get us started. This new book, The Idea, making the case for the positive contributions and value of both Christianity and Islam to the democratic experiment of the United States. Tell us a bit about the idea and the thesis.
Yeah, so I think that both Matt and I, we feel that something isn't quite right in broader American society. I'm sure a lot of you feel that way too. It's one of those things that you feel it, but you don't always know what the right words are to describe it. We think that part of what's happened in the past 20, 25 years is, it's not just that we think it, I mean, empirically there has been a decline in religion and religiosity in the United States. From about the late 1930s until 2000, church membership hovered at around 70 to 75%, so fairly constant and predictable. Something quite profound happened in the last 25 years where it's dropped from that high level to under 50%. So a precipitous drop in a very short period of time. And I think when we're trying to make sense of what's going wrong, that's an important part of the story. I think part of the argument that you would hear from secular voices was that as religion declines, we'll have more reasonableness, rationality, tolerance, we'll have more good things. But it hasn't quite turned out that way. What we've actually seen instead over the past 25 years is a significant increase in ideological polarization and fragmentation. But there's also a lot of other troubling indicators that go beyond our politics. You know, we have an epidemic of mental illness, deaths of despair, concentrated among young men and boys. We have an epidemic of loneliness. There's a lot of epidemics, in other words. And so part of what we want to do is to see where religion fits in and whether religion can be a source of renewal and whether religion can give us resources to deal with our current moment. I think I'm a product of a northeastern liberal elite context. I live in Washington, D.C., born and raised outside of Philadelphia. And I think that what I experienced in discussions and debates in this kind of elite area, these elite areas, is that religion is a problem. That religion, in some ways, is a problem to be solved by having less of it. And so we want to turn that on its head, and we think that an underappreciated aspect of religion is that not only is it about believing in the things that we think are true, it also is a force for good in our country in ways that are underappreciated. And that shows up in a number of different ways. I mean, we know from survey research that religious people tend to be significantly more happy than the religiously unaffiliated. So happiness is a good thing. We want more people to feel good about their lives and to feel fulfilled and to have a source of meaning. But then there's also more tangible outcomes that religious Americans, on average, compared to the religiously unaffiliated, are more likely to give to charity, participate in voluntary organizations. They're more likely to vote, less likely to smoke, less likely to drink. You know, any number of things that you can kind of see. There's a lot there, and there's a growing body of data that shows that, hey, religion is instrumentally a good thing. Even if we don't believe it's true, it can lead to good outcomes in the broader society.
Matt, what would you add?
Well, that was wonderful. I would add that my 3 young boys are here in the audience today. They will only be here for the first half, and then they got to go to bed. But I think their presence makes me. I just want to add this to what Shadi had to say, because I thought Shadi introduced it quite well. One of the things we're working on in our home is table manners and taking turns to speak and to listen and to ask each other about your day. And a big aspect of democratic life depends on table manners. Depends upon being able to sit at a table with people that you disagree with sometimes, learning to share, so cultivating those sort of habits. And one of the things that Shadi and I see in religion, particularly institutional religion, and I think we'll talk about this, is institutional religion offers citizens a space to talk about some very important things, to disagree about those things, and to reckon with those disagreements, and to cultivate a sense of belonging amidst those differences. So, like a fundamental sense is, in our home, just because you're upset, you're not allowed to just get up from the table and walk away. And an important aspect of democracy is not getting up and walking away, but actually sticking with it. And so I think we're thinking about that in terms of the metaphor of religion and politics. Americans are increasingly lacking communities in which they have to contend with difference over long periods of time. And democratic cultures depend upon that. They depend upon those virtues and those practices. And historically, houses of worship have been that sort of a thing. So you think of I'm an elder in the church, and I have to bring something that I care about, that I want the church to do this thing, and I make my case, and perhaps I lose, or I have to compromise. That's a space in which I learn that practice. But more importantly, I learn within the church that I belong to a people, and that I'm known, and that I'm safe. And so, when a powerful politician says, "I know you, you belong to me," or "you need me," I'm less interested in that because I have my people. So anyways, that's another aspect of what we're thinking about. But just to go back to Shadi's point there, the argument we're trying to make is that religion is not a problem to be solved, but it's profoundly it can be a gift to democratic life, and we want to explore what that looks like.
Okay, let's dig into the terminology a little bit, because the category of religion is a bit broad and vague. And we could certainly think of, well, in two instances, we can think of some religions that actually would not support democracy, that would be antithetical to many of the aspirations you just named. But even in a more complicated way, we can think of discrete manifestations of both Christianity and Islam that are anti-democratic. So what are you, I heard religion can be a good, but I think I need something more than religion. What are you describing, and what are you contrasting against?
You know?
Yeah, so I mean, Matt is Christian, sort of evangelical, although obviously that's become a problematic label, so I'll leave that to him. But
I've got to work on that. So.
I'm Muslim, so we are focused on our respective faiths and in a lot of our work, just because we know it best. And I should also say that in our own collaboration, really over the last, 5 years or so, we've been in dialogue with each other about different Islamic and Christian sources. For about 2 years, we had almost weekly like Zoom meetings where we would give each other reading lists and really make good faith effort to strengthen our knowledge about the other's religion. So we both know more about the other's religion as a result of this kind of collaboration. And so I should say that I find myself in the somewhat unusual position where I would actually like to see more Christianity in public life in America, even though I don't believe Christianity is true. And I think it should be possible. That might sound paradoxical. Well, if you don't think something is true, why would you want more of it? But I think that you can see the value in something even if you don't agree with it 100%, or that it's not your own set of truth claims. And so there is a kind of, I think, a way to broaden our understanding of religion, that we're not just focusing on our own and saying, well, I'm Muslim, I want to promote Islam in public life, to the exclusion of other faiths, as if it's some kind of zero-sum competition. That's not the way that we look at it. And I think that's important, because I think that there is a presumption that if you are a committed Muslim, you assume that Christians are going to hell or something like that, and vice versa. And if you believe that the other is damned for eternity, then can you really see them as a positive force for good? So I think that it's important to kind of counter that very, I think, rigid idea of religion, as each religion is cordoned off and has its exclusive truth claims. That's not to say that we're not relativists, I should say. Like, we both, as I just said, I believe my religion is true, he believes his religion is true, but we can find beauty, maybe that's another way of putting it. I see beauty in Christianity, and in part because it has a strangeness to it. It has things that I don't see as much in my own tradition, and that pushes me to reflect back and say, well, Matthew is talking to me a lot about, his personal, about love. He
Grace,
talks about
grace.
Love and grace. Those concepts are certainly there in Islam, but in the way that I was raised, they weren't as much of a focus in my particular community. So when Matthew talks to me about the power of grace and how grace is so difficult to even describe, there's almost something transcendent, magical, mystical about it. And then that forces me to think, well, what does grace mean to me? And how can I reflect that in my own faith tradition? And then I can look back at my tradition with maybe new eyes or a new perspective. So I think that interplay is really important here. As for the negative aspects of, we don't want to pretend that our co-religionists haven't done terrible things in the name of Islam or in the name of Christianity. Obviously, there's a long record of that. But that is something that's sort of, I feel like that's talked about so much in the kind of mainstream discourse. It almost goes without saying. It's in the air that we breathe, that religion is bad in all of these different ways. And we see extremists, fanatics, and radicals. And that exists, but that I think I would make the broader claim that religion on balance is a force for good. On balance, if we take it in its sort of full picture, in all of its different manifestations over time, the picture is much more complicated. I'm very critical of the idea that the absence of religion has led to better outcomes. If we look at the 20th century, which was the secularizing century, it is the most violent, destructive century in humankind. I don't think that's a mistake. The two most dangerous and destructive ideologies, communism and fascism, those took the lives of tens of millions of people, not, quite recently, actually. And so this idea that if we can just move away from religion and move to secular ideologies, that things would be better and things would be less violent, I think is completely belied by the evidence that we have.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add there is that the existence of destructive religion makes our case that much more important, that we're interested in exploring religion's capacity for generosity and civility and these sorts of values. So that's the project. The project is not simply just romanticizing religion. That's not our goal.
Shadi, I heard you talk about the discovery and a greater appreciation for concepts of grace and love talking to Matt, but I'm curious, specific to the issue of democracy, what is something that each of you learned in reading texts from the other's faith tradition and diving into articles, something you learned that surprised you in a good way, encouraged you about the potential of either Christianity or Islam for democracy, and also something that concerned you or troubled you in your discovery of the other faith?
So the word fatwa, I think for many Westerners freaks them out because they think of someone has a fatwa against me, I'm going to die or something like this, right? So it's a terrifying term. But actually, one of the things Shadi talked to me about was these medieval fatwas, which were essentially like a religious judgment. An Islamic jurist would make a statement. This is what I think God's will is in this situation. He would write it down. And one of the things Shadi said was that they had developed this practice where at the end of their religious judgment, where they said, this is what I think God wants, at the very end, they would always sign off with, but God only knows. And it had multiple functions. One was to remind the reader to hold this somewhat lightly, but also to remind the author, a sort of self-memory of, I need to reckon with my own finitude, my own mortality, that I am not God. And it created this critical space in religious political society for Muslims to have a sense of there is a distinction between God's wisdom and mine, and I need to have a posture of humility about that. And that being, for Shadi, a helpful resource as he engages political life to remember, I am not God. God ultimately is the one who knows. It's not me. And so I can make a statement about what I really believe. I have confidence this is what God wants, but ultimately, God only knows. And that it would be disrespectful for me to speak, to think I can put God in a box and that I can control God. And so that's a resource that Muslims have as they enter into democratic discourse, that they can have confidence, but they should not have that sort of total certainty that I control God and I can speak for God absolutely. And I just found that, that's great. Yeah.
And how about something that worries you from learning more?
Oh, something that worries me about Islam?
Yeah.
Oh, lots of things. Yeah. Something that worries me about it. Give me time. Let me think about that one.
Okay.
Yeah. So Matt introduced to me a Dutch theologian and politician named Abraham Kuyper. Some of you may be familiar with him, but if you're not, worth reading up on. And I should say, Matt is one of the leading American scholars of Kuyperian thought. And so Kuyper talks a lot about how how we as human beings in this world are broken by sin, that there's a sort of inherent imperfectibility about being in this temporal world, and perfection is not possible until the return of Christ. So that gives us space to delay judgment or postpone judgment, that judgment doesn't have to be found in the here and now. It can be pushed until a later period, perhaps the next life. And this gives us a way to relax our temporal politics and reduce some of the intensity, that not everything has to be resolved now. And obviously the concept of brokenness, being broken by sin, is there in Christianity, and Kuyper is just one voice that I think articulates it in a very powerful way for me. But brokenness is, again, not a concept that is very common, not in the same way in Islam. And I like the idea of brokenness because I sort of match that to a criticism of religion, that people will often say religion is a crutch for the weak-minded. And then I started to think about this word crutch. Why do people always say religion is a crutch? Because when I think about a crutch is a good thing. If you're injured, if you're broken, a crutch helps you stand up. It helps you walk to your destination. It helps you move. It facilitates your being. And if we all are inherently broken in some way, then all of us need a crutch. So it seems completely reasonable and appropriate that religion could offer that support, that scaffolding in our own lives as we walk in the world. So being able to sort of incorporate this idea of being broken by sin, and it just gives, I think, another, like a very powerful layer when we think about what religion can offer us. And it's also like a very tangible example, because I think most of us have used a crutch at some point. You know, I broke my leg. I guess a lot of people break their legs, but also other things that, hey, it's really useful. And I think religion is really useful. Of course, there is a danger in like instrumentalizing religion and saying religion is a support. It's just something I use for a greater end, and that's something that we do wrestle with. And it is preferable that you actually believe that it's true. So, I mean, we both believe in our respective faiths. We believe in their truth claims. But I think there is also an argument that religion can start with belonging and community, that oftentimes people don't have completely right doctrinal beliefs. If you ask people about like fundamental beliefs about, so Catholics, you know, is the Eucharist actually literally the body and the blood, you'll actually hear a lot of Catholics in polling say, we don't literally believe that. So that's incorrect faith. That's faulty doctrine. They're not actually following the correct beliefs of the faith they claim to uphold. But that's okay. I think a lot of us have things where you ask us, you know, do you have the right beliefs on all of these key creedal issues? We won't always get there 100%. And what is oftentimes more important is that we choose to be part of a community. We choose to belong with other people. And then beliefs can kind of evolve after that. So this pushes us away from, I think, a particularly Protestant way of looking at religion, which is about the interiority of belief, the autonomy of the self, and that it's private rather than public. Religion is much more complicated than that. It's not always about someone expressing a personal, sincere belief. It's about being embedded in an ecosystem, in a set of relationships with other human beings.
Okay, so I'm gonna come back to both of you in a minute on the what's bad about the other religion.
I have problems with Islam. I want to talk about.
Before that, and make it tie it to democracy. But I want to, before that, Shadi, push you a little bit, because you said a minute ago that it's better if people believe, but I'm not sure, based on the description you just gave, why would that be better? I mean, if somebody said, I don't believe any of this, but I love the community and I'm happier and I'm giving lots of money to charity and I'm pro-democracy, why would we care that why is it better to believe?
Well, I think practically most people who are part of a faith tradition believe in something. So if you're an evangelical who doesn't believe in the divinity of Christ, it's probably going to make it harder in the medium to long term to be a full participant in your evangelical community, because Christ is quite central. Islam is a very theologically oriented belief that if you don't actually believe in the profession of faith, which is that there's only one God and Muhammad is the final messenger, then it doesn't really make sense that you will pray 5 times a day or do the fast, because these are difficult things. Islam, I wouldn't say, is the easiest religion. It has, let's say, more ritual and more daily practices than many other faith traditions. So if you're just doing it based on like cultural identity or liking being part of a community, I just worry that's not going to get you very far. Some people can do that. But I think Christianity and Islam tend to be theologically centric faiths. So the belief in Christ on one hand, and the belief in one God and the Prophet Muhammad in the case of Islam. There are Orthodox Jews who are atheists. So Judaism is maybe a counterexample where you cannot believe in God in the Orthodox Jewish tradition, but you're still taking part in the various rituals of the Sabbath and being part of a very tight-knit community. And so it differs from one faith to another. I think that the instrumental argument seems like I think that when you're trying to persuade people, it's not always you're telling them, hey, believe in religion because it will make your life better. I'm like a very rational thinker, so sometimes I'm like, oh, let me just make the case to someone, and then they'll kind of see the light. But they actually have to see the light, and that requires something more than pure rationality. It requires, I think, making a jump, a so-called leap of faith. And that's the way most people operate on a deeper emotional level. Not all of us are going to make rational calculations about what would make us happier. So if I tell someone you should be religious because it will make you happier, they might appreciate that from an intellectual standpoint, but it doesn't actually satisfy what's in their heart. You have to move people with emotion and feeling, and that's where I think some of these instrumental arguments run into a wall.
Matt, one thing about Islam that scares or concerns you when it comes to being pro-democratic?
Yeah, I think, there's obviously Islamic extremism and illiberalism is concerning. That sort of goes without saying. But I think that, doctrinally speaking, what's so central to my Christian theology and belief and practice is this belief that God is love, and God calls us to love our enemies. That's sort of a central teaching of the person of Jesus. And so any sort of Christian democratic ethic is going to have to talk about the ethic of love and reconciliation and self-sacrifice. And I, so far, haven't found that sort of political ethic of love in terms of affection in the Islamic teachings around law and politics that I've found. And when I talk about love, Shadi's like, yeah, that's not really the way I would talk about these things. That's not to say that love is absent in Islam. There are lots of teachings about love, but it's not at the foreground in the way that I would hope it to be, in terms of how Jesus would talk about the love of one's enemies. Now, what does that have to do with democracy and politics? I think I would just say that American democracy is so divided, so angsty, so filled with fear and chaos and shouting that we desperately need humble peacemakers who are driven to love not just the people in their tribe, but actually the people who hold beliefs that they find abominable. And that is becoming increasingly unimaginable. And I think that within the teachings of Jesus, that becomes something that you can imagine. So love is, I think, an important thing that I would love to see more of in Islam.
Yeah, so the idea of loving your enemy makes me a little bit nervous, but in the reverse. I don't love the idea of loving one's enemy, but also apparently a lot of Christians don't love that idea either, because I don't think when you're thinking about like evangelicals on the right, you don't necessarily think, here's a bunch of people who really love their enemies and they're really kind of practicing that. So, I think it's a hard concept even for Christians
Yes.
to uphold, clearly. But I think that what I would prefer to see than loving your enemy, I think that it's totally fine to dislike your adversaries in politics because you're disliking them for legitimate reasons. There are people who have views that you find reprehensible or morally obtuse or whatever it happens to be. I think the challenge in a democracy is to say, I don't like him or this group or this faction or this movement, but whether or not I like them is irrelevant to the question, to the matter of they are a reality in America, and I have to learn to live with them. If there are 74 million Trump voters, I can dislike every single one of them, but also say they are fellow Americans just like me, and they have every right to the American idea and to participation in American public life that I do. We are all Americans, but we do have foundational disagreements. So being able to sort of square the circle on that, like learning how to dislike each other peacefully, or dare I say it, hate each other peacefully, to kind of be like, I really think this person is bad, but I will defend their right to participate. That's a test. That's very difficult for ordinary people to do. But I think all of us need to challenge ourselves and push ourselves to think about how we can do that and to extend that grace, so to speak. Now, one other thing that worries me, which is something that often comes up, so we might as well just put it out there. I get nervous about the evangelicalism of evangelicals. In other words, that evangelicals proselytize and see it as a core part of their faith to try to convert other people to Christianity. And I found this a little bit belatedly with Matt in particular. So this must have been like a couple years into, this is still early on, but we were getting to know each other better. We started to do some events. I think we were at some college campus, and someone in the audience had asked, well, what do you think about Matt wanting to convert you to Christianity? And I was like, wait, Matt wants to, he had never told me that before, that he wanted to convert me and bring me to Christ and so forth.
Sneaky.
Sneaky, indeed. Of course, it's right in the name, but I guess I had this idea that if he's a friend, presumably he's okay with me the way that I am. He doesn't need me to be something other than what I currently am. And that actually unsettled me. And we had like it was just, I don't want to say it was tense, but it was like a little bit of an awkward exchange on the stage because we hadn't really prepared for that conversation. And I think that this gets to, proselytization is tied to the question of being saved. I mean, and obviously not all evangelicals believe this, and it's more complicated, but many evangelicals believe that the only way to be saved is through accepting Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. And in Islam, there are internal debates about who can be saved and so forth, but at least in my understanding, it's much more mainstream, the idea that Christians and Jews can be saved even if they don't convert. Not everyone has to convert to Islam, and there's a kind of honored place for people of the book, which includes primarily Jews and Christians. And there are various Quranic verses that suggest that Christians and Jews have a path to salvation and so forth, although it's more complicated than that, but that's I think one of the mainstream interpretations. So it gets me really nervous, first of all, the idea that there's a lot of Christians who don't think that I can be saved, and for them it's really important to convert me because the alternative is potentially eternal damnation. That does make me really nervous, and I still wrestle with that, and I'm still not entirely comfortable with that. Of course, Matt, I should say, to his credit, was offended when he found out that I didn't want to convert him, because if he said, Shadi, if I'm a friend to you and you care about me, wouldn't you want me to have the truth? If you believe Islam is true, wouldn't you want to share that with me? So for him, he was almost offended. Share the truth with me. That is something you would expect of someone who cares who cares for you someone who calls themselves a friend? So it is interesting that there are different ways to look at that. And I'd never thought about that angle before, which just goes to show again that in being a part of these conversations, which are sometimes uncomfortable, there's like a new idea that sort of sprouts up that you're like, wow, okay, he just turned that entire idea on its head, and now I'm forced to look at this in a new way. So now I'm less worried about the whole proselytization thing. I'm still, so he's pushed me more in a direction of being like, okay, I can live with this.
As a theoretical matter, Christianity and Islam relative to American democracy are two really interesting thought experiments. As a demographic matter and social reality, these are apples and oranges. You've got a massive you're right to mention the decline of religion overall, but a massive segment of this country, Christian of some flavor, a tiny part of this country is Muslim. So how do you account for those demographic differences and maybe the pragmatic argument that you're trying to make?
The demographic differences. Well, I would say that one of the interesting things about Islam in America is while it's small, one of the aspects of Islam is it's quite visual. So, it just takes a few hijabs in a neighborhood and you notice Islam quite quickly. I can be quite secretive as a Christian in my suit. And the visual element of Islam and its publicness, I think provokes within all of the Americans who encounter the hijab, just encounter it. They, you're walking through the grocery store and you encounter a woman wearing a hijab. You have to suddenly reflect upon, for just a moment, oh my goodness, first of all, my neighborhood is changing. What do I think about that? How do I feel about that? You have to reflect on why is she wearing that? What is she thinking about? What is she going through? Why don't I wear that? What sort of choices have I made? The simple, the public strangeness of a small group of Muslims in America is, in an important sense, an opportunity for every American to reflect upon their own convictions, their willingness to be public about those convictions, and how they feel about deep difference engaging them. And those are the fundamental questions of pluralist democracy. And so while Islam is quite small in America and has very little power in America, its public strangeness, in my mind, is not so much a threat to American democracy, but it's a profound gift, specifically to my fellow Christians who need to reflect on, as a Christian, what am I willing to be public about? What am I willing to be strange about? This woman is willing to suffer because Muslim women historically in America are victims of oppression and violence and sorts of things. This woman is willing to suffer for her faith. And here a Christian is being invited to reflect on, am I willing to suffer? Am I willing to be strange? And so even the smallness of Islam in that should be understood as a gift to American democracy in an important sense. The other side of it, as an evangelical, Shadi opened up by talking about how the church is dying dramatically in America, and that sense of death, it includes a sense of a loss of control. So evangelicals losing control of America, and that fills my fellow evangelicals with regret, despair, anger, a wide variety of emotions. And so as the demographic decline is going on, evangelicals are having to reckon with, okay, how do I live in a country that I no longer control? And that's a very new experience. It is not at all a new experience for our Muslim brothers and sisters. They are very aware that they do not control America. And so it's counterintuitive, because why would an evangelical want to talk to a Muslim, right? We're asked that quite often. But if I'm looking to figure out how can I be faithfully strange in America, in a country that I don't control, I would say my Muslim brothers and sisters could teach me some things about what it means to be strange and small.
Okay,
in
so
a
that
democratic
sounds,
life.
that's a beautiful thought experiment.
Push me,
And
come on,
I would
John,
believe
let's
that you, Matt, might walk into
Yeah.
a store and be convicted of your strangeness
Yeah.
by seeing a Muslim. In many parts of this country, if a Muslim walks into the store, the response is not, what a gift, it's time to pass an anti-Sharia law. So how does theory meet practice in at least parts of this country when it comes to seeing the difference in Islam?
How does theory meet practice? I'll tell a little story, and hopefully it gets at what you're going for there. My mentor, Richard Mao, the name of this chair that I sit in,
Not that actual chair, but the...
not this chair, professorial chair. So he was the president of a seminary and has a bunch of evangelical buddies who run their own seminaries and evangelical colleges. And there was a political issue in Washington, D.C. that was going to be, it was going to constrain religious colleges and seminaries in a very important way. And so he and his evangelical buddies were talking and say, hey, we need to go to Washington, D.C., and we need to just speak up for Christian rights. We need to go lobby for Christian colleges and Christian seminaries. And he said, well, wait a minute. What if we did it a little different this time? What if we went to Washington, D.C. with my Catholic friends and my friends who run the Mormon school and my Jewish friends and my Muslim friends? What if we all went together? And as we think about these kinds of demographic changes, one of the things that's going to be in our future in America is if you want to fight for religious freedom, you need to do it with you need to find some partners who are not just you. And you don't need to fight for Christian rights, but for religious rights. But ultimately, I think you're absolutely right. Many Christians in America do not respond to Muslim immigration well. In fact, the most Islamophobic group in America is white evangelicals. The most Islamophobic group is us. And so I would just say that means I need to work harder on this. But there's much more to say about that.
And just a note about strangeness, because I've perceived it quite differently. I found Christianity in America to be quite strange and very rare. Again, like living in a major urban center that's left-leaning and liberal. Growing up, I didn't really have much exposure to Christianity. And as an adult, I did go to a Catholic university, but I barely even noticed it was Catholic. I won't mention which university. Well, you probably guess which one that would. Well, Georgetown. I loved it. It just, it felt like it had lost maybe some of its Catholic edge. But like going, as my sort of professional career went on, and then living in D.C., it was very rare for me to encounter Americans who were outward and open about their Christian witness. I can maybe count on one hand the number of friends, not even close friends, just like friends more broadly, who had ever said something like, I believe in Christ, or talked openly about their relationship to Christ. However, it was quite common. Well, I am Muslim, so I know obviously more Muslims than most people. But for me, Muslims in D.C. were much more open about their faith, because if you are a minority, if you're a person of color, people don't necessarily think that professions of religiosity are that uncool. But if a white Christian says, I'm Christian, it's like, ooh, that's icky. Whoa, that's decidedly uncool. You don't really say that in polite company, especially if your friends are Democrats and left-leaning people and so forth. So it was pretty remarkable to me, like looking back at a big chunk of my life in America, that Christianity, like, I was like, where is this Christianity? Like, people tell me this is supposedly still a Christian country, but I don't really see it. It's not really much in evidence. And I think that's an unfortunate thing, that people don't feel, even people who do believe, don't feel very comfortable expressing it. And even I've experienced this to some extent with some of my friends, that they've known I'm Muslim for a long time, but then they're like, but you don't really believe in X, Y, and Z. I get that you say you're Muslim and you believe in some sort of like vague sense, but you don't really believe in an afterlife. Do you really believe in hell? Like, there is something about the liberal mind where they're like, you seem really smart. And my friends are like, Shadi, you're so smart, you're so intellectual, blah, blah, blah. You really believe this stuff. So I think that there is a part of America in the kind of elite, left-leaning space where Christianity has become quite strange and looked down upon. At least that's my experience.
What do you do, I mean, given what you just left us with, what do you do with the challenge of having a lot of Christians in this country who would not fit the mode of humble peacemaker, but might be self-interested, anxious voter trying to control, and correlatively, particularly internationally, expressions of Islam that seem very anti-democratic in many ways, and very not good for people trying to have more robust civil rights. So you have within your own traditions these pretty strong and powerful anti-democratic trends and influences, and how do you? That seems like a bad fact for each of you.
Okay.
It's not fun to have to deal with that. No, it's. But I think that that's the task before us. We don't get to pick the time when we're born and the place that we're given, and the only thing we can do is point them to these resources within the faith. But I would go farther than say resources. I would say commands within the faith towards humility, patience, love, joy, peace, and that the sort of desperate grasp for power and doing politics by fear is just completely divorced from the Christian gospel and the sort of peace that Jesus gives. So the only way we can do these things is to speak against it. Yeah.
Okay, I would maybe take it from a different angle. When a Christian does something bad or something anti-democratic, that doesn't mean that their Christianity is what's causing the bad behavior. I think we make this analytical leap that is oftentimes unfounded. So when a secular person or an atheist does something bad, we're not like, oh, he's a secular person, it must be his secularism that made him do X, Y, and Z. We're willing to kind of entertain more of a gap between the identity of the person and what they're actually doing. Similarly, whenever a Muslim does something bad or something violent anywhere in the world, it's like, oh, it's because he's Muslim. We're making a causal claim without further investigation. I mean, in my work on Middle East politics, I've often argued that one of the primary explanatory factors for understanding civil conflict, civil war, violence, extremism in the Middle East is just extreme levels of repression. Most of the Middle East is authoritarian, where people live under brutal dictators. That affects how you engage in politics. If you are deprived of legitimate ways to express your grievances, you're more likely to resort to violence. So we can come up with secular explanations as for why people use violence.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily because Islam is telling them to do that. And it's worth noting that even if we take recent examples of violence committed by Muslims or Islamists, take Hamas's atrocities on October 7th, it's worth noting Hamas doesn't really rely all that much on theological reasoning. They use secular reasoning for what they did. And Al-Qaeda is somewhat similar in how they justified 9/11 and other extremist acts subsequently. If I had to boil down a somewhat complex argument, it was often our enemy is so savage and so brutal that we have to suspend the normal rules of warfare, and we're going to go all out in our reaction. So that's how they would get around the prohibitions on killing innocent civilians. They would basically say, well, America, with all of its imperialist wars and all of its repression, it's supporting dictators in the Middle East, what it's supporting in Israel, that therefore we have to fight fire with fire. And I find that obviously evangelicals who are on the far right are not equivalent to Al-Qaeda. I want to make that clear. But we still have similar questions like, why are they acting in a way that seems counter to the democratic spirit here in America? And what I often hear from far right Christians who I'm in some kind of dialogue with, they'll say, yeah, you're right about like all the love stuff and example of Jesus Christ. That's all nice, but desperate times call for desperate measures. We are under attack, and therefore we are going to suspend the normal rules of engagement. This is what every far right religious or religious extremist group says. They said, we know in our tradition that there are all these things that you shouldn't kill civilians. It's very basic. But what else can we do? We have no choice. These are secular arguments that people are making, even if they seem to be religious actors. And I think it's just worth being much more critical about the claim that religion is what is making people do certain things. It's much more complicated than that when you look at people's actual motivations.
Yeah. So on that line, as you look at religious extremism, Muslim extremism and terrorism and Christian nationalism or Christian sort of white supremacy movements, the specific people who are most vulnerable to those movements tend to be young men who are unemployed, unmarried, not directly connected deeply to a church or a mosque. And it's that detachment, that sense of powerlessness, that sense of loneliness. They often get drawn into forms of extreme political spirituality through online methods. It's not so much institutional religion and religious families, but it is that disconnection that makes them vulnerable to those things. And you see the exact same things in Christianity and Islam.
I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll turn it over to you all for audience questions. Do we have mic runners? Yes, great. So we'll get ready. My last question for you before we hear from others is how, it kind of goes back to where we started, but I'm wondering how generalizable are the aspirations and the normative claims you're making? Could people of other faiths look in and say, aha, they've got something on this religion plus democracy thing? Or do you have to be very tradition specific and draw upon particularized resources to make a case? And then maybe relatedly, for the growing demographic in this country that rejects sort of transcendent faith altogether, what would you say to them about the democratic experiment and their own resources to contribute to it?
Yeah. I think what I would say is, as a Christian theologian and an ethicist, I can help my fellow Christians think about how to be ethical politically and to wrestle with these kinds of questions. But my ability to help those who are not within the Christian faith is limited. It can be sort of invitational. So an example would be, this concept Shadi and I talk about in terms of delayed judgment. I'm having a political discussion or a political debate right now, and I really want to convince you, and I really want to win, and I want this judgment to be right now. A lot of our political discourse can have that kind of urgency, that sense that it needs to be imminent, it needs to be right now. I need justice done, and it needs to be complete. What Islam and Christianity offer us is this understanding that justice cannot be complete today, but God will do justice in a delayed fashion. And so it is right and good for me to expect a sort of proximate justice, a piece of justice today. And so that is a theological resource that I have found within my Christian faith and that Shadi has found within his Muslim faith. Now, as we think about outsiders, your garden variety secular American, it's simply an invitation to ask them, how will you delay your judgment? How will you cultivate a patience that recognizes, I can't accomplish everything I want right now? And that's going to be something for other religions and other spiritualities and so forth to wrestle with. This is how a Christian and a Muslim do this. So, I have no interest in sort of imposing my Christian political ethic on the whole of America. But this is how I deal with deep difference, is this recognition that I am not God. I am not the ultimate judge. Or the way that Christians might talk about it is Christ is king, and that means Christians are not. And they cannot, and they should not. And so, I think it has to be invitational. It can't be something we project onto others. But American democracy depends upon its citizens finding a resource to delay their judgment. And increasingly, American citizens are coming up short.
I think religion also, offers, and I just mean here religion, more broadly, and I think that others can apply this in different ways, that life is elsewhere, that politics is not and should never be the be-all, end-all of your existence. And I think one problem that we see is people are investing so much of their hope into the imperfections of politics. Politics cannot deliver what they want it to deliver because politics is inherently messy, chaotic. You don't always get, actually, that's the very idea of democracy. Democracy is about institutionalizing the act of
disappointment.
losing. Yeah, it's like, it's about learning to lose. That is absolutely essential. So, I think that, I see a lot of, the youth, the youngsters who are just like sort of, they end up wanting so much from politics that they get so disappointed. And so there is a risk of seeing politics as giving you a promised land in this world. The promised land, we would say, should not be in the here and now. And that's like a very dangerous thing to want. And that's led to violent utopian movements. Again, I mentioned the example of communism, which saw heaven on earth. You should never think that heaven is achievable on earth. So, ideally, religion allows you to chill. It allows you to take a step back and say, okay, life might suck, life is suffering, politics sucks, my candidate didn't win, but at least I got something going for me, in theory, in the next life. That is a kind of, that's a reassuring thought. And I think it doesn't always do this to people, but it can. And I think we should all reflect on whether we can feel that more. If we don't get what we want in 2024, it isn't the end of the world. It's not literally the end of the world, especially if you believe in an afterlife. And I would also say that hell is important as well. And we are sort of thinking about a chapter in our book that will be called The Case for Hell. Hell is totally underrated. Totally underrated. So I look at, I remember when Putin invaded.
Shadi, they liked you, and then you said that.
Yeah, hey, but hear me out. Yeah, there are a lot of things that we see and we can't grasp them. That how is evil possible? How are certain politicians or dictators doing these evil things? When Putin invaded Ukraine, or Bin Laden 9/11. I mean, take your pick. World War II, the Nazis. We have a lot of examples of people doing awful things. Now, oftentimes dictators are not held to account in this life. They get away with it. Putin will probably get away with it. Take your favorite dictator or your least favorite dictator. They'll probably get away with it. So that presents a really big problem if you believe in justice. You are probably not going to get an accounting for their sins in this life. Hell, in a way, resolves that problem, that if you can't get them punished now through some kind of criminal court or some kind of trial or whatever it might be, that you can have faith, you can have a kind of reassurance that, just to use the obvious example so we don't get into any controversy, like Hitler, Stalin, Saddam, that they will spend a long time in hell being punished. That is really reassuring to me. That actually does address in some fundamental way the question of justice. And I think that it's unfortunate we're so uncomfortable talking about hell that we don't even know how to sort of conceptualize why we find it useful. It's there for a reason. If we believe in God and we believe in our respective traditions, Christianity does have an account of hell. Islam has an account of hell. Presumably they're there for a reason.
Okay, we've set up nothing controversial, so looking forward to your vanilla questions. Please do keep them in the form of a question. Anyone want to get us started? In the middle there.
There's a microphone coming to you.
So I was going to say something else, but now we're talking about heaven and hell. I have to ask you this. Is it possible that the idea of the afterlife, whether you're Muslim or Christian or anyone, alienates us from each other more than settles disputes? I think the idea that I'm going to heaven and you're not is a way to increase my prejudice. In other words, to look down on you, condescend to you, and even, have contempt for you. And that's obviously not what a Christian is supposed to do. But I'm thinking that sometimes we're talking about subconscious ways in which we put other people down. And I wonder if the afterlife is one of the ways we do that.
Yeah, so first of all, I don't think we should ever say, I'm going to heaven, you're going to hell. It's only God who decides who enters heaven and hell. And in sort of making definitive claims about who,
Although you did just say that Hitler and Stalin and Saddam were.
I mean, I think that those are the obvious cases. I mean, look, if they're not going to hell, then no one's going to hell. So, I mean, I think I'm on pretty strong ground. Obviously, God will make his own choices, and, but for most people, it's probably a bit more complicated. But even with those examples, in the end, of course, God is the decider and has jurisdiction. And we can only make suppositions in that sense. But there is, I think, something dangerous if we're telling people, oh, me as a mortal, flawed human being, I'm making a judgment about your permanent state. That should, in most circumstances, be left to God alone. And I think part of the problem is so many of us want to play God. We want to make judgments when it's really God that should be making those final judgments. I'm a believer in salvific inclusivity. In other words, you don't have to be one faith to get into heaven, that there's more room for maneuver. And I just think it's also logical. I personally don't think it doesn't make a lot of rational sense to me this is me, that a Christian would go to hell just because they had committed what I would consider to be a theological error. Why should someone be punished with hellfire for a very long time because they in good faith made an understandable theological error? In other words, believing in the Trinity or the divinity of Christ. Is that really the worst thing ever? So just on a very rational basis, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me.
Sorry. Can I jump in? I think the core assumption is that theological differences create problems. And I think what I would say to that is that's not necessarily true, and theological differences are inevitable. So theological differences make us feel uncomfortable. So Shadi may have said some theological things tonight that you found offensive. And when we find something offensive or something difficult, our shoulders go up, our teeth clench, our fists, and we want to raise our hands, and we want to debate with Shadi for his theology, right? Or mine. But you want to contest that, and so this particular question has to do with, heaven and hell and our differences about these things. But the key argument we want to make is that, number one, theological, political differences are just a reality. They are just a reality. You are not going to get rid of people who disagree with you because they will always be there. And in fact, you will disagree with yourself on issues of theology. And so the more interesting question is not how can we get rid of all of these differences of opinion, but how can we navigate them well? And so John Lennon's by far worst song was Imagine, just an absolutely atrocious song. And it's a wonderful example of this. Imagine there's no heaven. It's, and his whole understanding is like, if we get rid of this belief in heaven, we will all be fine. And what Shadi opened up with was this basic modern fallacy that if we just stop thinking about heaven, we'll all get along. We'll all be rational. We'll all be peaceful. And we will all have the sense of a common good. And we see the evidence before us that that's just not true. That we are believing species. We believe in things. We hold on to them dearly. And the question is not, how do we get rid of these beliefs? How do we stop having passion? How do we stop, joining groups and religions? The question is, how do you deal with those deep differences and those experiences of real stress when you encounter something that you find abominable? And so this, I think one of the things that Shadi and I really recoil against is, it's very common today to talk about America is so polarized and so divided, we need to be unified. That's what we need. We need a unifier. And honestly, that just makes me so nervous because I just want to know, okay, who's the unifier? Am I the unifier? Awesome. Right? Do I get to set the umbrella that you are all going to sit underneath? And so we have to accept that being polarized is an important aspect of being human. This is an important aspect of just human history. And any illusion you had of national unity at any point in American life is an illusion in a very important sense.
I wonder if there are any recently published books to help us think through these questions.
Oh yeah, actually, there's one that I came across.
The questions in the back. There was a hand in the back. Yep. Great.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much for your contribution to all of our learning this evening. I train over at the medical center on the other side of the park, and I was wondering how religion can contribute to politics insofar as it affects the bodies of others. So how can religion influence politics of healthcare? Because I think this is an area where religion often earns its bad rap or undeservedly gets a bad rap. So how does religion in politics, how can it express values that benefit how other people's bodies are treated?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Well, I think it's important to name that the hospital is an invention. The hospitals don't just happen, they're created. And they were invented in Europe by Christians with a sense of Christian mission. They weren't just people who were interested in healthcare. These were Christians who believed that human bodies are made in the image of God and are sacred. Now I know, some of us look at our bodies and it's hard to imagine that they're sacred because they're not that great. But Christians have a conviction that bodies matter, that they have deep value. And the bodies of everyone matter, not just those who are strong and healthy and smart and handsome and 6'3" and no. And so when it comes to issues of healthcare, I think what we're increasingly seeing in the West is valuations of bodies and which bodies get to live and which bodies don't. Which bodies are seen and which bodies are not. And the sacredness of the body, regardless of its capability, its ability to contribute to capitalist growth, is something that Christianity, Judaism, and Islam can all offer, frankly, to a Western healthcare system that is increasingly driven by issues of efficiency and power, and to stop and say, actually, these are not numbers. These are precious, precious bodies. So, yeah, I think that's incredibly important. That comes up for issues of euthanasia and healthcare equity and abortion and all of these sorts of things. So.
I know I'm not supposed to comment, but I'm so intrigued by the question. We had a job candidate at the law school recently who gave a paper on the legal status of dead bodies, and the super interesting sort of premise and conclusion of the paper was you cannot explain why we have abuse of corpse statutes or why we require human bodies to be disposed of in certain ways and apart from other matters. And when you detether it from sort of a transcendent frame that informs a bunch of Western jurisprudence. So I think this paper was just trying to make a descriptive point, but I thought it was super interesting connected to the consequences of the body and the understanding of the body within a religious framework.
Oh yeah, there's a philosopher who talks about how, if you were to die and I were to spread lies about you after you're dead, that is still a sin within Christianity because you're still a human being. I'm still sinning against you even though you're not alive. But there's not really a secular concept of a way to rationalize that. Like, why is it wrong to lie about someone who's dead? And just something to think about.
Other questions? Oh, right here in the front. Let's wait for the microphone just for the recording. Thanks.
Thank you guys for coming to speak. Some of the past lectures in this series have been about the parody of religion, and so things like Soul Cycle or Reverend Billy's Earth Church, where it's a community and a shared vision, but without belief in a higher power. But then also in American society, it seems like there's a rise in spirituality and meditation, which is belief in a higher power, but without community. And I'm guessing I'm wondering why does religion couples the two, and what does the coupling of them mean for democracy rather than them being separate?
Oh, wow. That's really good.
Yeah.
Coupling the higher power and the community. Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah. Well, I think, just why are people moved to be a part of these sort of spiritual groups that don't necessarily believe in the higher power? That's not part of what they do. Soul Cycle doesn't. I mean, it's called Soul Cycle, which is interesting. Why did they choose that name, right? But if you believe that God exists, then presumably God created us with certain inclinations. And he would have presumably instilled into us a desire for transcendent meaning. And that desire is inscribed in our hearts, if you will. So even people who are not religious or don't think they're religious find themselves moved by religious impulses or spiritual impulses. So that's how I would explain that you can have atheists who are really into things that mimic religion in important ways, because it is part of who we are, again, if you take our premise that God exists. Now, I don't think those are good things to be a part of. I mean, I do a secular meditation myself in addition to religious stuff, or I go to yoga or whatever. There's a lot of different things like that, but they're not quite as, they're missing something important.
Yeah, so like a yoga studio, for example, I don't know if I've ever seen a yoga studio start a homeless shelter. I don't know if I've ever seen a yoga studio, start a refugee resettlement campaign. I've seen mosques and churches do that. And I think that one part of these newer forms of spirituality, this is not all of them, but a lot of them, are focused on self-actualization. So we provide practices for you to, self-actualize, for you to reach your goals. So it is sort of a spiritual service that we provide you. In a sense, it's actually fits better within a capitalist worldview in the sense of you have it as something
It's
to offer.
self-referential.
Yeah, but with connecting the vertical element of God is actually this belief that God commands you to start caring for the homeless, or God commands you to start a school, or God commands you to start a hospital, or things like that. The purpose of a church is just not to make me feel good about me and help me actualize, but like Christianity calls me to die to myself and to serve others. Islam literally means submission. And so I think that democratic life, I would argue, I don't know if Shadi would argue the same, it requires sacrifice. Citizens have to sacrifice. And as I think about, soldiers in World War II who went off to sacrifice, you have to be willing to give yourself to something bigger. And what I worry about with these new forms of secular spirituality is it's not built around self-sacrifice. Often it's built around self-actualization and making me more peaceful or more flexible or more, but it's about empowering me and discovering who I am. And democratic life requires citizens who are not like that.
And I'll just add to that. I mean, if you look at all these secular spiritual type things, they sort of treat the human being as we're startups of our, we are like the CEOs of our own individual companies, where our job in life is to self-optimize. We always have to be improving ourselves and doing more and being more at peace and doing the meditation practices. It fits, again, as Matt alluded to, into a kind of capitalist model. And I think that the whole self-care, self-actualization space there's something very mechanistic and machine-like about it. It's supposed to be spiritual, but it's really about life hacking and this constant desire for the perfectibility of the human experience, something which is, of course, impossible. So I just think that if you actually look at what undergirds a lot of these things, there's actually quite negative things. Not to say that you shouldn't go to yoga, but you shouldn't. Yoga, I don't think, is a replacement for the deeper things, and it doesn't offer. It doesn't offer answers to transcendent questions, but it gives us the illusion that we're doing something that's spiritual.
I just want to say that was a wonderful question. Yeah, that was really good.
Let's do last question up here. Yep, and then I've got one more, and then we have a reception.
So when we're speaking about the interaction of religiously motivated people and the democratic experience, is democracy more dependent upon religion, or is religion more dependent upon the existence of democracy?
Yeah, that's
It's kind of a chicken and an egg type of question.
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty clear that it's democracy that depends on religion, because religion can flourish in some pretty rough environments. And in fact, in many ways, it does better in rough environments. So Christianity is exploding in China, much to the, the disappointment of the Chinese government. And I think as to the other side of democracy's indebtedness to religion, I think this is one of the key paradoxes of democratic life is that democratic governments cannot sustainably exist without democratic virtues. They require a citizenry with a certain level of patience, a certain level of trust, a certain level of table manners, as we talked about. These sort of virtues and a willingness to sacrifice. But the paradox is a government can't create those virtues. By and large, like, federal programs are pretty bad at passing on virtues. Families, religions, it turns out, are much better at handing those things down. And yet when the government tries to direct a church or a mosque, it tends to go really badly. So the issue is that America and the American democratic experiment depends upon things that the state can't make and the state can't direct. And American democracy will not last unless we have citizens with patience and trust and these sorts of things. And so then the question is, this is Jeff Stout, political philosopher at Princeton. Like, this is how he ends his book on democracy and tradition, asking, where will these streams of democracy come from? Like, what will water the American fields of democracy? Now, he's an American pragmatist. He's not a religious person. And so he has this sort of optimism about America. And he says, we will essentially water our own grass, that we are the source, just being Americans. I mean, he's very optimistic about being we as Americans will water our own garden, and we will make ourselves democratic because we're Americans. It's actually quite exceptionalist in that way.
It's similar in some ways to what Obama said, that famous phrase, we are the ones we've been waiting for.
Yeah, we are the ones we've been waiting for. But that kind of optimism rings pretty hollow in 2024, that actually America is in need of an outside source. The state has not been able to replicate democratic values. And for Shadi and I, we're not saying Islam and Christianity are perfect or always good or innocent. But we're saying we're finding something really beautiful within these very ancient faiths that have typically been seen as a problem for democracy. We're finding ancient resources that it turns out can be really helpful in cultivating that patience, that humility, that willingness to sacrifice, and that is worthy of consideration for America.
So my last question on picking up on the topic of ancient resources, I want each of you to give one recommendation from the other's tradition of one resource that people can read to better see the connection between religion and democracy. And you can't say the Bible or the Quran, so you've got to be a little more specific, but give us something from each. And Shadi, why don't you go first?
So a book or resource?
You choose. And
I'm actually not going to go with a book. I'm going to go with a practice, and it is fasting. So Shadi's just gone through Ramadan, and he's been fasting, and we continue to have meetings during Ramadan, but he can be cranky when he doesn't eat, and so it's better to have a meeting with him in the morning than later. But Shadi is he's a very, as you can tell, he's very gifted. He's also very ambitious, so he works very hard. He wants to be productive, and when he fasts during Ramadan, it's very frustrating for him because he can't be as productive. And he also feels strange and kind of left out in Washington, D.C. when everyone else is eating and drinking and partying. He feels weird, and he's hungry and he's not productive. But that practice does a number of things for Shadi. First of all, it reminds him that work is not the most important thing, that being productive is not the most important thing. It also reminds him that as much as he would like to fit in, he doesn't. And that's important. And it reminds him of the importance of his relationship with God and the things that he holds most dear. Now, Christians do have this practice of fasting within their history, but we really don't do it. We really don't do it. And my friend wrote a book on fasting within Christianity, and one of the things that he argues is that historically, when Christian monks would fast, it was not just a personal thing, a spiritual thing between them and God. It actually had a social element to how they related to the other monks. And what they discovered was as they fasted, they didn't fight so often with their fellow monks. And they reflected upon when they felt angry, when they felt cranky, they reflected on what that crankiness was about. And the monks found that fasting was an important part of being a monastery, being a community, to reflect upon their own finitude and so forth. And so what I would commend to my Christian brothers and sisters in the room is this Islamic invitation to rediscover the power of fasting, not just as a personal spiritual thing between you and God, which is the way Christians often think about it, but it often is a way of reorienting yourself towards your family and your friends. And frankly, we have messed up relationships with food. And often our relationships with food have something to do with control. That we are sort of fully in control of our diets. And there's something really important. There's a political potency to that, isn't there? That this belief that I can be in control of this country, or my tribe can be in control of this country. And ultimately, these issues of pluralism are about opening that hand and letting go and recognizing this is not something I can control. So fasting would be my way.
Shadi?
Yeah, let me see. So I already used Kuiper, so I can't use that. The idea of brokenness, grace. I would add, this is maybe a longer conversation, but I'll just do like a very short version of it, is, I mean, human rights have a Christian provenance. I mean, if we look at our declaration, it's right there that inalienable rights endowed by our Creator. And the idea that human beings have sort of inherent rights or natural rights, although people can debate exactly what those words mean in this context. But if something is given by God, then human beings can't take it away. So if our rights come as part of God's will or from God in this sort of transcendent sense, then you can't have a mortal human being come and say, well, you no longer have rights, I'm taking them away. And if you, the founders weren't all Christian. They were certainly products of a Christian environment. They were almost all believers in God. So some of them, like Jefferson, did not believe in the divinity of Christ, but were, theists or deists and so forth. So, but these are, and there's an excellent book that kind of goes into a lot of detail about where the idea of rights first came from. Nicholas Walterstorff's book, Rights and Wrongs, which Matt recommended to me, and I just found it just absolutely eye-opening. But you go back to about the 12th century, perhaps even earlier than that, with some of the earlier Christians, even I think in as early as the 3rd or 4th century, where you start to see where the idea of, it's not quite individual rights, but it's a precursor for it. And human beings created in the image of God. It's already in our language that each and every human being is someone deserving of dignity, regardless of anything else. That there is something just foundational there. And I think the more that I've read about kind of obviously human rights, perhaps there are excesses and it's gone in directions that not everyone is comfortable with in kind of expanding what we mean by rights and so on. But we have to be careful when we say that we don't want Christianity, because if in some ways liberalism is secularized Christianity, that a lot of the ideals that we hold dear as secular Americans actually come from a different source that is not always acknowledged. And I think that's really important. We should be careful. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. If Christianity helped give us or helped pave the way for some very important modern ideas, we should be careful what we wish for when we say that we want Christianity to recede.
Professor Valeri?
Well, before we express our appreciation for our panelists, I wanted to say two things. One is this is the last public programming for the John C. Danforth Center during this academic year, but we're gearing up again in the fall, especially in a presidential election season. We will have plenty of more events and hopefully draw you in. Number two is there's a reception that rates. I hate to say that after a speech on fasting, but there's a reception outside. We hope you enjoy that and conversation. And finally, I want to thank and hope you will thank with me our panelists for this wonderful discussion. Thank you.